As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me today is a voice I'm sure you're familiar with. It's an honor and privilege to be in conversation with Professor Mohammad Marandi. How are you? And welcome to The Malcolm Effect.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's just go straight into it. We've seen, alongside the genocide taking place against the Palestinian people, we have seen the fall of Assad's government. We have seen a ceasefire taking place between Iran and Hezbollah. Many folks are asking about the future of the Axis. Many folks asking about where Iran will position itself going forward. Many folks are also speaking about the kind of internal dialogue taking place between the reformist camp and the more, Islamist camp as well in Iran. So I guess, what is your assessment right now, given that what we've seen since October the 7th? Where do you think, or what are some of the conversations that Iranians and Iran is having going forward for Iran's role in the region?
Well, ever since the revolution, the Iranians have been supporting the Palestinian cause. And Iran is the only country that supports the resistance and arms the resistance, whether it's in the West Bank or in Gaza. And this, of course, is in line with Iran's policy of supporting the press and standing up against foreign hegemony and domination. Iran was supporting the resistance in South Africa against the apartheid regime there at a time when the West was supporting the regime. And, for example, the ANC being the leading resistance organization back then, Iran supported its military wing, whereas the United States and the UK considered the ANC to be a terrorist organization and Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist. So Iran's policy towards Palestine has been consistent with its policy towards apartheid South Africa. And Iran's objective is the same as in South Africa. Iran believes that this supremacist regime must come to an end, and that the people of Palestine must live together as equal human beings. The resistance, as we saw over the last 14 and a half months, have been supporting the Palestinians in Yemen and Lebanon and in Iraq. They've been targeting Israeli targets in order to put pressure on the regime to end the genocide in Gaza. But genocide continues because it's supported completely. It's supported by the collective West, and they arm the regime. They provide it with ammunition, with aid, with political cover, and of course with media cover as well. So it is an ongoing struggle, but I think it's clear that the Israeli regime, after almost 15 months, has been unable to take Gaza, which I think is a massive failure. In the past, they would go all the way to Suez Canal, and or in Lebanon, they'd go all the way and take to the capital and take Beirut within a short period of time. But in the battle in Lebanon, they failed to get a foothold inside the country. But most importantly, the Israeli regime has been exposed to the world as a brutal and barbaric and backward regime. When Archbishop Desmond Tutu visited Palestine, he said that the late Archbishop, he said that the situation in Palestine was much worse than under apartheid South Africa. And that was then, not now. Now it's infinitely worse than what it was then. Or when Nelson Mandela traveled to Gaza, he supported the Palestinian right to armed resistance. He said that in Gaza. So Iran's policy towards Palestine is in line with the policy that was supported and the views supported by resistance movements across the global south. The situation, you may be alluding to, of course, the situation in Syria. For the Iranians, the Syrian government was always a deeply flawed government. President Assad or former President Assad was probably the best of the regime, and the Ba'athist regime was not something that Iran was particularly fond of. But for Iran, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and their affiliates are much worse. And the fact that the Americans and NATO and regional despots and regional client regimes of the United States have been supporting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, it doesn't matter what their names are. Jolani, the head of HCS, was the deputy of al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. He was the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And when he split from Al-Qaeda, it was with the support of Al-Qaeda. It was for PR purposes. Al-Qaeda supported the separation. So it's not a real separation. So for Iran, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are worse than a government in Syria or in Damascus, whether it's under President Assad or former President Assad or anyone else. That would be worse. And that is why Iran has always opposed this. But unfortunately, Mr. Erdogan, who has been supporting these terrorists for well over a decade, Biden and Netanyahu were able to undermine the Syrian government. And now we see the Israeli regime has occupied a significant chunk of Syria, in addition to what they already occupied illegally. And they've taken control over a huge amount of Syria's water resources. And they and the Americans have bombed the Syrian infrastructure and destroyed it with hundreds of airstrikes over the past couple of weeks. So Iran is opposed to this. And I think time will tell that having Al-Qaeda govern Syria is not a good idea.
Thank you so much for the answer. And one more from me then. And there's this racist Orientalist understanding projected onto the East and the Arab-Iranian region, as if to say that those who live in the East and the Muslim world are just people who believe in their leadership like a cult-like following. It's this racist projection of Orientalism, right? And what we do know is that there are lively debates that take place across the world, particularly in Iran, on several geopolitical questions, right? And we know there's debate, there's critique, there's differences of opinion. For some of the people, we see online discussions as well about this internal debate and discussion currently on the future of Iran as it pertains to resistance, but as it pertains to Iran's position in the region more broadly and how it relates to other countries in the West as well. Do you mind just briefly telling us, like, what does these debates kind of sound like? Some say that with the election of President Pezeshkian, we're seeing he still believes, and this might be mischaracterization, but he still believes that we can work with the West. Whereas like other folk in Iran vehemently disagree. Do you mind, just maybe unpacking that for us?
I think you already have provided the answer to the question. There's always a strong inconsistency in Orientalism because everything non-Western is given negative attributes. So Iran, for example, is evil, it is backward, it is corrupt, it is despotic, it is imploding, it is unpopular, they beat women, they abuse the innocent people, it's a growing threat. But if it's so unpopular and if it's just imploding all the time, and if it's and if people hate the so-called regime, as they like to call it, then how can it be a growing threat? If something is, constantly collapsing, if the car is breaking down, how can it be a threat to a Formula One race car? That's the inconsistency of Orientalism. What makes all of these inconsistent ideas believable simultaneously is the whole notion in Orientalism of the non-Western world being inferior. So if they say, well, Iran is a growing threat, makes sense. It's they're evil, and they're dangerous. Iran is collapsing and people hate, makes sense. It's an Orientalist despotic regime. But then you say, well, how can it be so despised and hated and brutal and incompetent and unable to manage itself and mismanaging itself and corrupt, but at the same time a growing threat? Then that becomes a problem for the Orientalists. How do they put these two inconsistent arguments together? The problem is that they can't, but most people don't see through this because the Orientalist mentality is so strong. So even though it cannot be both at the same time, they do believe it is both at the same time. And that is what makes Western analysis on Iran, whether it's mainstream Western media, whether it's Western think tanks, that's what taints their analysis so much. And that's why they're constantly miscalculating. Nowadays in the United States, it's interesting that many people are skeptical of the mainstream media. Trump himself, I don't know if he coined the term, but the term fake news became big under Trump. And I think Trump's opponents would agree with him on that mainstream Western media is not believable. But ironically, when it comes to the foreigners, the non-Western world, it is still believable. In other words, when it comes to what's going on at home, when it comes to social justice, when it comes to corruption in the United States, when it comes to the oligarchy, people don't believe it anymore. But when it comes to Iran, when it comes to these nasty, terrible, awful countries out there, these the Orient, then a lot of people, those who don't trust the mainstream media or these think tanks or these pundits, but in these cases, they still do, and I believe it's because of the sheer power of Orientalism, which has existed for centuries. And it's not something, the decolonization of our minds is not something that's easy to do. It's easy to say, but it's very difficult to achieve. In Iran, as you pointed out, I don't agree with the way in which they frame the debates, but on the one hand, they say it's a dictatorship and despotism. On the other hand, they say there's this, debate going on in Iran. And the reformists and the conservatives, or they're at each other's throats. Well, does that mean that there's a freedom of speech in the country? Does that mean that people speak their mind in Iran? Because that's what it sounds like, but that doesn't fit with the narrative. So on the one hand, they're acknowledging that there's open debate in Iran and there are different positions, but on the other hand, they're saying it's a despotic regime where everyone has to shut their mouths. Anyway, the fact is that there are differing views. So there are no two camps in Iran. In the so-called reformist camp, there's great diversity. In the so-called conservative or the principlist camp, as they are often called, there's much diversity, and most people are in neither camp. Most people are but independents, as you would say in the United States. But I would argue that overwhelmingly people have sympathy for the Palestinian people, especially after Gaza. The view towards the West has gone sour, even among the liberals who are more pro-Western, who are proportionately speaking larger in number in the reformist camp, even though the reformist camp is not a liberal camp. As I said, it's very broad and diverse and mixed. You will see a lot of overlap between different camps in Iran, and you will see differences within camps as well. Anyway, I believe that this has always been Iran's policy, that we should keep the door open to the United States if it is sincerely willing to change policy towards Iran. But I think that Iran has learned its lesson and that it's not going to sit and wait for the United States. And Iran is going to continue to pursue better ties with countries across the global south, the global majority, China, Russia, neighboring countries, India, BRICS countries. And the future is not in Europe or the United States, especially Europe. And so Iran is not going to tilt towards the Americans after all the United States has done. But if the United States changes its behavior, doesn't matter who's president, then the Iranians will reciprocate. But Iran's policy towards Palestine is clear. Iran does not accept ethno-supremacism or any sort of supremacist regime in Palestine.
Thank you so much. Christian, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to, because I really appreciate you going over the different kind of ideological weapons of imperialism, especially all these racist mythologies. But I also wanted you to be able to speak on some of the economic and financial weapons of imperialism, namely sanctions, and the role that they played in the recent happenings in Syria, as well as the region more broadly. And what does the path forward look like for Iran in navigating against these sanctions?
Well, what basically, in my opinion, the most important element that brought down the Syrian government was the sanctions. It destroyed the economy. It killed many people. It has broken Syrian society. On the one hand, the Americans occupied roughly 40% of Syria. They're stealing the oil in the north and the east of Syria, and they're stealing their agricultural products, which the north and east of Syria is the agricultural heartland of Syria. So they're starving Syrians on the one hand, and they're stealing their assets on the other. So Syria for the last decade has been going downhill, especially during the past few years. So ironically, the Syrians won the dirty war, where the Americans and the Europeans and Erdogan in Turkey and these oil-rich despots in the Persian Gulf, they were sending in ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They defeated them, but then the Americans decided to, and the Europeans decided to strangle Syria as hard as much as possible. And that has created devastation. And in the case of Syria, it has succeeded. This is what they're doing to Cuba or in Venezuela, increasingly Nicaragua. They're also doing it in our region. They're doing it to Iran. Iran is a much more resilient country. It's a very powerful country. But the sanctions hurt Iranians a lot, and it has a significant impact. It's nothing like Iran is much more powerful and much more resilient than Syria, but it is a weapon of war. It is brutal. It is barbaric. It kills people, but the West uses it, and they hide the reality from their own public. Well, maybe they don't. I don't even know if they care to hide reality, because right now we've seen an ongoing Holocaust in Gaza for the last 15 months, and the West doesn't seem to. Well, the states and the Western media, mainstream media, they don't care. They want to distract attention away from Gaza as much as possible, or they want to justify this Holocaust as much as possible. I wonder what these people would have done if they were working for Nazi Germany during the Second World War, how they would have justified what they were doing back then. But in any case, it has caused major devastation, but it is also a catalyst for countries across the global south, or the global majority as it's also called, to find a means to do trade and business without using Western financial institutions or the US dollar. And so ironically, the United States, by weaponizing the dollar and Western and American controlled financial institutions, they are creating an incentive. They are creating a catalyst for countries to tilt away from the US-led financial order.
To kind of follow up on that, one thing I appreciate you is mentioning Cuba. And I know in a recent interview you had talked about Cuba before, and you made a similar observation that some of my comrades that I organized with made in a trip to Cuba. And that was that, the material conditions of the society make it easier for a certain generation to be ideologically susceptible. That what we were seeing is that there's almost a generational gap with regards to the revolution, that younger folks have a harder time tying themselves to the revolution because of the change in material conditions. And when you speak of Iran's resilience, what do you think could be learned by other countries in the global south about maintaining revolution intergenerationally and creating kind of like an ideological armor against material attacks on people's well-being?
Well, in the case of Iran, culturally speaking, Iran is deeply influenced by history. And the grandson of the Prophet of Islam, and his martyrdom in Karbala has a deep influence on ordinary Iranians. And the fact that he was unwilling to appease the tyrant of that era, and he said no to humiliation. And then after he and his companions were martyred, his sister was taken in front of the representative of the despot, and he said, well, how do you feel now? Now that, how? And she said that all I saw was beauty. In other words, she was saying that despite the fact that her brother and her relatives and all those around her were martyred, she saw the beauty of resistance against, the despot, against brutality. And this has a huge impact on Iranian culture and society. And it's commemorated every year on Ashura in Iran. And it's probably the most widely observed holiday in Iran among ordinary Iranians from all different backgrounds. So that has a huge impact on how Iranians resist. But also, I think the experiences of different countries in the global South increase they help to continue resistance. For example, when the Russians were slapped with sanctions, many Russian delegations came to Iran, and the Iranians gave them their experiences. Or, for example, when Venezuela, when its electricity was targeted, when its electrical power plants were targeted by the Americans, and when the siege was imposed, Iran sent engineers to fix the power plants and to help them revive the refineries and to help them increase oil production. So different countries, in the case of Iran passed on its experience to Venezuela, to Russia, in order to help them overcome. The case of Cuba is a very different case. Cuba is a very small country, a very beautiful country. I spent a few hours with a number of young men and women, university students, very sharp kids, very passionate about their country, but they were saying that many people in Cuba are just tired, they're exhausted. And that's what the Americans wanted. That's what happened in Syria. In Syria, they just brought people to their knees, and people just wanted relief. And the same is true with many in Cuba. I always, whenever the Americans talk about, for example, that Iran has failed, or Russia has failed, or Cuba has failed, or Venezuela has failed economically, or they mismanaged themselves, I always say to people that they put their necks on the economies of different, on the necks of people, and then they say, look, he can't or she can't breathe. That's basically what's happening. So I'm not a communist, but I think that the economy would be substantially different from what it is today if it were for the brutality, if it was not for the brutality of the United States. I've been to Venezuela, I think 3 times now. I think the situation in Venezuela would be significantly better than what it is today if it was not for U.S. sanctions. So I don't think the Americans or the Europeans are in any position to gloat or to judge others when they're trying to strangle them. It's obvious. There's no level playing field. The reason why Iran, by the way, supports Cuba and Venezuela and South Africa, and of course South Africa under apartheid, it supported the resistance, or Bolivia, or Nicaragua, or Syria, has always been because Iran's position is that the West is working against the interests of those people, and the West is trying to dominate those people in those countries, and they're trying to impose regimes on the region, in those countries that serve their purposes, serve their interests rather than the interests of the people in those countries.
Thank you very much. Aden, closes out with the final 2 questions.
Yeah, hi, Professor. I think one thing I want to ask is, every time we see the Zionists or the West launch an aggression and Arab-Iranian region, whether that be the martyrdom of Ismail Haniyeh, the martyrdom of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, and now the most recent circumstances in Syria, there are a lot of people who are very quick, and their first thing to say is to blame Iran and Iran's failure. So I'd like to ask you what you would say to them, and what is your pushback on that?
Well, first of all, I think they should think about a number of things before they criticize Iran. One is that Iran has been fighting against 40 countries effectively, and that is the collective West that has been supporting the Israeli regime. It's not just the United States. It's NATO, all of NATO, including Erdogan in Turkey. It includes Korea. It includes Japan. It includes Taiwan. All those countries that are firmly in the American camp, they are supporting Israel. The embassies are helping Israel. Their NGOs support Israel, and their media supports Israel. Their governments support Israel, the Israeli regime. So Iran is one against all this huge coalition. The second is that countries of the region, ever since the genocide began, have been doing business as usual. Mr. Erdogan constructed a pipeline between Baku and the Israeli regime. It was under Erdogan that this was constructed. He continues to transport cheap oil from Baku to Netanyahu during the Holocaust. Even after the ICC finally stated that Netanyahu has committed crimes against humanity and issued an arrest warrant. He didn't even use that opportunity to stop the oil trade. Jordan, business as usual. Egypt, business as usual. The Emirates, business as usual. So when countries across the Western world and their local client regimes or their allies are effectively siding with Israel, then I don't think people should expect Iran and Hezbollah or Hamas and Ansarullah in Yemen or the Iraqi resistance or Islamic Jihad to, do everything that they aspire to do. They can't do miracles. Hezbollah has made great sacrifices for the people of Gaza. It also, as I think we all know, they've prevented the Israelis from having a foothold in Lebanon. Gaza has not fallen, and the Israeli regime, its image across the world has been completely destroyed. And this is thanks to Iran. There's no doubt about it that the military capabilities in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, and in Syria as well, they are because of Iran. And it comes at a great price, financial price. Iran continues to fund the different groups, and it comes at a cost due to the sanctions and the hostility of the West. So Iran has been the only sincere government that has made huge sacrifices for the sake of Palestine. In Turkey, Mr. Erdogan has spoken about Palestine, but he's not done anything for Palestine. He didn't give them a single bullet. He didn't stop. He said that he'll send his troops to Lebanon if the Israelis attack Lebanon. He didn't do that either. All he did was he imposed Al-Qaeda on Syria. He imposed the deputy of ISIS, Mr. Jolani, who was the deputy of Abu Bakr Baghdadi, on Syria. He imposed the head of Al-Qaeda because he was the head of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had they're split from Al-Qaeda. HTS was only for PR purposes. When the split took place, there is footage of it. I tweeted it a few days ago. He praised Al-Qaeda. He praised Osama bin Laden. He praised all these terrorists, but it was for PR purposes so that they could, to fix their image for a Western audience, as we've seen CNN and BBC do over the past few years. So, he helped bring down, cause great trouble for the resistance, and I think that what happened in Syria is extremely detrimental to the interests of the Palestinian people. Again, Iran was no fan of the Syrian government, but for Iran, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates are infinitely worse than whatever existed in Damascus. But I think that this is not over. I think that people in the region are looking at Syria and they're seeing how under Jolani, the Israelis are advancing. They've destroyed the country's infrastructure. Erdogan hasn't done anything. And I don't think that these extremists are going to treat Syrians well, nor are they going to be able to fix the economy. So time will tell. I think this will be a huge burden for the people of Turkey, who don't deserve this because they are very pro-Palestine. But Mr. Erdogan is doing it for his own sake. But I think he and Netanyahu and Biden are miscalculating for two reasons. One is that the regimes in the region that are feel most threatened by Al-Qaeda or HTS and its affiliates are in the American camp. They're the ones who are vulnerable to these extremist groups, not Iran, not the Iraqi government. Parts of Iraq are, Western Iraq, but not Iraq. But Saudi Arabia is vulnerable, Jordan is vulnerable, Egypt is vulnerable. All these countries are vulnerable. Turkey is vulnerable in the sense that Turkey has a very Sufist culture. Sufism in Turkey is very strong. That's why Iran and Turkey have similar cultures. But Salafism and Wahhabism in Turkey has risen. And I think after this, it will be a further challenge. But also the economic burden will be heavy because this is a country that has been broken. So I don't think that things are going to end here. But Iran will continue to support the resistance. Iran believes that the main problem in this region is Zionism and ethno-supremacism. And the reason why the United States creates so much destruction and devastation in our region is because of their support for Zionism. And that is why that unless Zionism comes to an end in Palestine, there cannot be peace and stability and security in West Asia and North Africa. And only when Jews, Christians, and Muslims are seen as equal human beings in Palestine can the broader region see peace and quiet.
Yeah, and I think as my final question, just to follow up, as you're kind of saying, that the resistance is in a world forced with people who are either complicit or partners in the Holocaust in Gaza, are forced to deal with that reality and are not always meeting their aspirations. Now, given the circumstances in Syria, what do you think are the calculations the resistance are going to make moving forward? Is Ansar Allah in Yemen going to become even more involved? We've seen them never leave Gaza's side, with most recently them striking Tel Aviv with a Palestine 2 missile. So if you could just expand on that.
Yes, I think that the resistance in Lebanon, in Yemen, and Iraq will continue. In the case of Syria, we have to see how it plays out. I think that contrary to what the Americans are saying, that ordinary Syrians are very worried about their future. I've been to Syria many times, and I've been to Damascus University quite often, and I've lectured there. Students at Damascus University over the past few years, although life has been very tough, they never preferred Al-Qaeda and HTS and the others over the Syrian government. Many that I've spoken with were supported Assad, many opposed him, many hated him, many loved him. They were always very differing views. In recent years, there's been much more pessimism about their future because the economy has been so bad, and a sense of hopelessness prevailed. But no one that I ever spoke to, even indirectly, alluded to any sympathy for them. They were always worried about Al-Qaeda, and they're right to be worried. So this attempt by the United States to fix the image of Jolani and the terrorists that he leads and the other factions is because they want to help the Israeli regime. And Erdogan has done a deal with them. He wants a piece of the cake for himself, and the Israelis get what they want. And he's hurt the Palestinian cause. But as I said earlier, I believe that the Israelis and the Americans and Mr. Erdogan will not succeed in Syria, because I don't believe that the people of Syria, with all of their diversity and the educated class, I don't think they're going to accept a bunch of people who've been killing and slaughtering innocent people for years, who believe that anyone who thinks differently from them doesn't have a right to live. A group that's been supported by foreign intelligence agencies for well over a decade. Everyone knows Jake Sullivan's email by now. Everyone's heard about him saying Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. The Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012, which clearly stated that U.S. and its allies wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And the head of that agency, General Flynn, at that time, he was the head, stated on Al Jazeera, of all places, that Obama supported this policy. Or the fact that John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, said we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. All of this, I think, is not lost upon ordinary people in Syria. Maybe some Syrians abroad, or many Syrians abroad, support these groups for a host of different reasons. But I think those who are opposed to these groups are probably more quiet, because in the West, as my Iranian and Arab friends have told me many times, if you take the wrong side in the West, it leads to a lot of trouble. So it's obvious that one side is going to rejoice and the other side is going to be quiet. But I think, and some people in Syria are going to rejoice. But remember, when Saddam Hussein was overthrown, and Iran opposed the war against Saddam Hussein, even though Iran hated Saddam. Saddam invaded Iran with the support of the United States and the Soviet Union. He used chemical weapons that the West gave to him. But the Iranians were against the invasion of Iraq. Why? Because Iran said the United States has no moral authority to invade Iraq. The United States should stay out of our region. And if you recall, I'm sure you don't recall because you're young, but if you go and look at the footage, when the Americans took Baghdad in 2003, Western media went to the square where they were bringing down Saddam Hussein's statue. And you could see these crowds all cheering. And this is what the Western media showed. But only later did we see pictures which effectively showed that the square was almost empty. It was only around the statue that this crowd was cheering. But Western media made it look as if there were like tens or hundreds of thousands of people there. So in Syria, you're going to see a lot of people cheering, but a lot of people are hiding in their homes and living in fear. I think living under Al-Qaeda is not something that any of us would find to be an ideal situation. So just as we can't trust the Western media when it comes to Gaza, I think it would be very foolish for us to trust the Western media and Western narratives or Arab oil-rich the narratives of Arab oil and gas-rich dictatorships. It would be foolish to trust those narratives, just as it would be foolish to trust their narratives on Cuba or Nicaragua or Bolivia or Venezuela or anywhere else, or in the past in apartheid South Africa and the general South African region.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor. This has been an amazing conversation. I encourage everyone to tap in and check out Professor Mohammad Marandi's work. And until next time, everyone, peace out.
Thank you.